Hey everybody, it's NathanBranson here, and I'm going to talk a little bit about the why and the how of poetry. So this will be applied to anybody who's in my 125 class or my 231 class, and I think this could be helpful to either of those sections. Specifically, if you're, I just want to go over a couple of basics of poetry, since it's an online for any of my online classes, and also reviewing for any classes that are face-to-face. So I'm a big fan of poetry, first off. I write it in my free time. And I just want to go over a couple of reasons why it matters and why we study it, and then briefly go over how to do it, or how to read it, some things to look for. After that, I'll talk about Walt Whitman a little bit, who's considered by some people to be the greatest poet in American history. So let's start off with the why. So why do we read poetry? Why would the state of North Carolina want you to study that in literature? And I think a quote that is from William Faulkner, who I really don't know if he wrote much poetry, but he was a novelist. And he said, "The poet's voice need not merely be the record of man. It can be one of the props, the pillars to help him endure and prevail." So really, poetry, I would say one of the first reasons is here for us to survive and to inspire us. And if we don't have something to motivate us or to give us a reason why we're doing something, we're probably going to give up. So he is, Faulkner saying that as something that helps us to endure, move forward, and give us motivation. And personally, in my own life, I think I write poetry more than I read it regularly. So I know that for me, it motivates me when I write it, and then I can see what I've written down, which leads to my next point, which would be help us to remember the good and difficult times of our life, sort of like photographs. So I think whenever we write poetry or read it, it can help us make sense of reality. And that's one of the coolest things about poetry. And we have a tendency to forget things. We don't remember, we just forget things. And so sometimes the reason we often take photographs is to remember a moment. So if you try to think about in history, photographs weren't around until, the 19th century. So how would they remember things? A lot of times they would write poems to remember events. And it'd be like a way to remember that moment in time. And so that is one way that they have used poetry in the past as a way to remember something before the photograph. In the last 30 years, the photograph has become more and more prevalent, to where we're taking photographs of so many things. If something happens, people pop their camera out. But maybe in the past, a way to commemorate a moment of something good happening, something beautiful, you see something beautiful, or even something tragic, you could write about it in your personal journal in either like a diary in sort of journal form, and you're just saying, this is what happened today, or write a poem. So we have a tendency to forget, so poetry can help us not forget those things by writing a poem. Briefly, to share one of my own experiences, I wrote it once I was living by myself, and I was employed in a small town, and I wrote a poem about this pig that would come into my backyard, and it would pretty much dig up little holes in my backyard, and I would have to run it off because it would dig up holes. But one day I chased the pig, and it wasn't a wild pig. It was just my neighbor had pigs in his pasture, and this pig would come over in my yard and dig up holes, and it was a potbelly pig. So I wrote a poem about that, and it was really cool because one day I actually ran after it, and you wouldn't believe how fast potbelly pigs can be. So I just decided to write a poem about it, and it's sort of a clear way for me to remember that. time in my life, which sucked because I didn't have a job, and I was a substitute teacher, but it felt like I was unemployed. So that was one way for me to remember that, and it's a good way for me, it works as a way to remember. So we have poetry to help us remember. So whenever you're reading these poems, I would suggest you think of yourself, maybe you writing a poem after you read an Emily Dickinson poem or a Robert Frost poem or a Whitman poem. Think of how you could actually do that. It also it tends to appeal to our desire to want to tell a story. So a narrative, one of the main ways we have narrative today is either you're watching Netflix or a YouTube video, or telling a story to your friends when you see them. We are storytelling people. Humans like story, and that is just the way it is. We use stories to, in a way like Faulkner said, to endure. And so we are always thinking about how we can communicate what we've experienced into a way to share that with somebody else. So that is another good thing about poetry. It can tell a story. It doesn't have to. You don't have. It can be as images or just pieces of an experience. It doesn't have to tell a clear story, but it can tell a story. And also poetry. This is sort of a side point, but it often works with the speed of our minds. So if I try to write a journal entry about me and this pig that I used to see in my backyard, I used to chase it off, and on a daily basis where it became actually kind of fun and funny. It would take me longer to write that out, but if I write a poem, it's faster. So poetry, I think, is faster to write down. And a lot of times we don't have much time, and so sometimes poetry you have a strong emotion, and we can put it on the page quicker than a full, like, this is my journal entry about this thing that happened to me. Another thing that is awesome, and you'll especially see this if you're going to read Emily Dickinson, is poetry can help us document the moments that are obscure and emotionally impacting us. And if you think about Carteret County, we are not the biggest county in North Carolina. Before I moved here, I did not know much about Carteret County. And I always thought about Charlotte, Wilmington, Raleigh, Asheville, sort of like that. Greensboro, that's where I'm from. But I didn't think about the coast very much. So we're kind of out here, and we're kind of I don't know if there's been really any movies set here. But if you watch television is always set in L.A. or New York City. Not always, but a lot of things to an annoying degree are set in these big cities like New York City. Now, New York City's cool. Actually, this is set in New York City, which is cool. But you kind of ask, like, what about all these other places in America? Do they have stories? Do people live there? Are their lives meaningful in Carteret County? Does your life matter in Carteret County or in other small counties in North Carolina or any other place in America? And in a way, if we watch a lot of television, we can get the impression that your life matters if you live in a big city, especially New York or L.A. And L.A., another place that has a lot of attention because there's a lot of movies made out there. So poetry a lot of times can get down and be the opposite of that, where you're seeing pictures of small, obscure moments that individuals have that aren't on television, that are very personal and sort of unseen. We'll use that word. And so if you think about Emily Dickinson as a person, she wasn't a public figure. There's only like 3 photographs of her, where there are many more photographs of Whitman, but in her time, she just wasn't a public figure. Her poetry didn't get any interest until after she had passed away. Got a little bit of interest, but generally she was kind of a behind-the-scenes woman who didn't get any publicity. But her poems she's considered top 5 poets in American history, And then she's writing these really short poems about her experiences. This woman who didn't really even have much of a social life. So poetry can capture those moments that are obscure. A writer of one book I read recently, a poem carries with it our hope and our ghost, our individual experience, and our social history. And so definitely our hope and our ghost, like some of the unseen things in our life, and again, individual experience that is unique to a person. Another thing about poetry, if we take pictures, pictures only capture the external. They don't capture the internal, the thoughts, the stories, anything like that. We are well documented in American history right now. We're documenting everything and all the time. So I guess in 50 years, our grandchildren will see all the videos we took of them when they were babies or whatever, and all kinds of things. But my friends and I talk about whether they should take photographs of their kids and post it on social media is what I'm saying. But poetry is able to go into the internal, as is fiction. If you're just as we were reading Rebecca Harding Davis, if you read her short stories, or Edgar Allan Poe, it goes into the internal thoughts. Okay, so those are some of the why. Why do we read poetry? Those are some reasons why we read it, and we want to be not just reading it, but I also think you should be writing it, just like Ralph Waldo Emerson talks about in his essay, to be a writer, not just a reader. Now, how do you read poetry? So I'm going to address that as well. And how do you read it? And I'm just going to sort of briefly go over this because I could talk a long time about this. But one of the, just like 2-3 simple tips to think about as we read poetry is that you want to read it all the way through, even if you think it's boring or you're sleepy or you're just not getting it. You're like, this person lived so long ago. And poets rely on subtle hints. They're not going to announce in the first 3 lines what their poem is about. It's for you to figure it out, okay? Just in the same way, when you're watching a movie, they're not going to tell you this movie is about this. They want you to stick with them and find out the backstory first. So poets rely on subtle hints for you to find their themes. It's your job to figure it out. And they're not trying to make it some kind of puzzle, but in a way it is to figure out if you can pick up on the hints of what they're trying to say. So make sure that you read the poem all the way through. I would say twice. So I actually read personally a Robert Frost poem that I read in college recently, and I had to read it 2 times before I remembered why I liked it so much. I liked it in college, and so I read it again. It's called Mending Wall. And the second time, I was like, oh, yeah, this is why I like this poem. So read it twice and be patient. It's going to take some time for you to figure it out. And if you have a book, that you like, book that you like. This is the book that I like. I like this version. And this is something I've had for a long time. But in your textbook, or if you print it off online, it's really good to take notes on the side, the annotations and in the margins and all that. So if you can, take notes in the margins about what you think it means. What do you think it means? And that helps you stay engaged to give you clues and you put those clues together at the end and say, is this what it means? As opposed to sort of giving up. So we don't want to give up. Another thing is I gave out this poetry terminology, and you've got all these terms that you learned in high school, and alliteration, analogy, figure of speech, hyperbole, imagery. I will read back over this, and I would try to use these terms as you're sort of explaining the poem to yourself, and try to figure out what kind of imagery is Walt Whitman using, and why is he using repetition, and what kind of metaphor is this? So when you learn the terminology of poetry, it makes it much easier. okay? And so you can use that and put words to what you feel, because most people think these things about the poem, but whenever they have these terms, I typically could, just have you do a quiz on this, which I might do in some classes, but for my online class, I don't have that in there right now. I might in the future. But sometimes I think I might need to do that so that I have to force people to really know these terms. So whenever they read Emily Dickinson, they're like, oh yeah, this is personification. Again, these seem like stuff you learn in middle school, but they do help you, and it's good to review them, even if you think you know them. Maybe you don't. Last thing is trust your instincts. Like I said, write down in the margins what you think the poem means and try to gather what you're picking up. So trust your instincts, and you're like, I think this is what Emily Dickinson's saying here in the margins and writing about it. And this is what the imagery reminds me of, and those kind of things. Just in the previous study in my 231 class, we had guess what themes were on this video. We had the video about the two angels and the guy who's doing drugs. So I think really trust your instincts, take notes, and try to guess what you think it means. We do this all the time with songs. We listen to the songs, and we're like, is that what the song means? Maybe it does, and we kind of analyze it. So do the same thing with poems. Last, another tip, same thing I suggested with that video we watched. So look for one of those, which I posted on Moodle, themes that are universal, big universal themes in literature. And those themes are the themes that, what is the good life? How should parents act towards their children? How do we deal with death in life? How do we deal with suffering? What is the nature of romantic love? How do we deal with alienation from those around us? Should we conform to society or be original? Should we submit to authority? What's the relationship between different generations or genders? How do we deal with excessive poverty or wealth? So these are just some universal phrases that I put together that are just common. You're going to see them over and over. So if you have a list of these, which I put a list of them online, I would get a hold of these and try to get those in your vocabulary to put those themes in there. You might see something that's not listed, which is likely, but if you have this theme list here, it helps you. Okay, so here's some more themes: chaos and order, beauty, coming of age, rebellion, disillusionment, prejudice, class difference, class struggle, innocence, loss of innocence, self-awareness, vanity is downfall. So those are all themes that you're going to see in literature, whether you're studying American literature in the 19th century or Japanese literature. So these are universal themes you're going to see, and the more you understand these, the better you're going to be able to verbalize what you think. Because you can analyze poetry. It's just a matter about knowing some of the terminology. So if I think about Whitman, that's kind of the end of my spiel about why and how. But if I think about Whitman and I think about what kind of themes are in Whitman, I can look at this societal questions that I've got here, and I can already see that he talks about what is the good life. He's wrestling with that. He's wrestling with how do we deal with alienation from those around us. That's one of the main themes that you can take out of Crossing Brooklyn Ferry. And what is the relationship between different generations? What is the relationship between different strangers or people? So just looking at that list has already helped me identify what themes are in Crossing Brooklyn Ferry. So let's talk about that a little bit, and let's talk about Whitman, and talking about 10 minutes. So Whitman is kind of the guy who came after. He's the guy who came after Emerson, and after Emerson is wrote American Scholar, and he talked about this is the kind of poet that I'm hoping America will produce. And whenever Whitman came along, Emerson reviewed some of his stuff very positively, and he's like, "This is it." So he's like, he's kind of manifesting all the things that I was hoping that would happen, which is he's documenting the American experience. Crossing Brooklyn Ferry is based in New York City, and it is Whitman is talking about a lot of the experience of being an American. That's one of the main themes of his poetry. And as we read, Emerson wanted to push forward and to document what is an American identity, who is an American. And this is actually in the middle, right as the Civil War is about to start. And so that was actually a pretty hotly debated topic. Who are Americans? Is the South going to break off and become its own nation? So that was something that was being debated. However, Whitman really didn't think of it like that, and I'll talk about how he thought about it. Cool. All right. So Whitman, and so let's talk about comparison between Thoreau and Whitman. Whitman's an extrovert. Okay, so I like to think of Whitman as the extrovert, and Emily Dickinson and Thoreau a little bit more introverted. So Thoreau's in the woods, and Thoreau is a prolific writer, and he wants to make a difference, but he might be maybe more in between because he's writing to the world a lot. Whereas Emily Dickinson is in a house, like her family's house, and she's writing sort of alone by herself, sort of hidden from society. Whitman is writing about has a lot to say about the Civil War. His brother's fighting for the Union, and so he's the extrovert in the sense that he's a public figure in New York City, writing articles. But then on the side, he's a poet. And Crossing Brooklyn Ferry is a sort of an extrovert's poem. And if you think back in the day, this poem really is about people watching. In today's terms, you might think of people watching if you went to New York City. If you've ever been on the subway in New York City, that is a amazing place that people watch and just see all the different types of people who are, on the subway. All types are there. So this is on a ferry. And in the same way, there wasn't a Brooklyn Bridge there. So from what I understand, this is what people took from, I'm assuming, Brooklyn to whatever is on the other side. I think it might be Manhattan. I can't remember. So the ferry, just like if you take a ferry from Ocracoke to Cedar Point, Cedar Island, one of those, you're on a ferry for a certain amount of time, and sometimes you can kind of relax and look around and see the people on there. So this is what Whitman's doing in Crossing Brooklyn Ferry, and he's watching the people. And if you look at the first stanza, he says, "Crowds of men and women attired in the usual costumes. How curious you are to me. On the ferry boats, the hundreds and hundreds that cross, returning home, and more curious to me are more curious to me than you suppose, and that you shall cross from the shore to shore years hence are more to me and more in my meditations than you might suppose." So he's saying, I'm seeing all these people, and I'm thinking about you. So it could sound a little bit creepy. Some people say, well, that's weird. He's thinking about these people that are strangers. But he is wanting to give us the impression that he's wanting to connect with all these strangers. And that is an extrovert 100%, right? I want to meet all these people who are around me. I want to talk to them. That's one thing that you can think about. So, as I said in the themes, how do you deal with the alienation from around us? So I don't really know if he doesn't seem like he feels totally alienated. Maybe he does a little bit, but he wants to connect with the people around him. He's wanting to befriend them, seemingly. So that might be a theme we could look at. Whitman wanting to overcome alienation from others. So the section 2, again, more about curiosity about people. And the current rushing so swiftly and swimming with me far away, others that are to follow me, the ties between me and them, the certainty of others, the life, sight, hearing of others. So he has this emphasis on other people. Others will enter the gates of the ferry, cross from shore to shore. Others will watch the run of the flood tide. Others will see the shipping of Manhattan north and west and the heights of Brooklyn to south and east. Others, so he has this emphasis on other people. And then he says 50 years hence, so 100 years hence, so like actually he's talking about us now. People in the future will experience the same thing as me. And then in the section 3, he says, it avails not time or place, distance avails not. I am with you, you men and women of a generation or ever so many generations hence, just as you feel when you look on the river and sky. So I felt, just as any of you in one of a crowd, I was one of a crowd. So the first 3 sections are about him building connection with the people around him. So maybe if you're on a subway in New York City, you might look around, you might say, I feel different. I'm from North Carolina, and I don't know these people, and this is their life, and you kind of draw differences. But here, Whitman's drawing all the similarities between himself and the people on the ferry. And that's I think it's a push towards drawing similarities. In today's society, I think we oftentimes look at all the differences that we have between ourselves and other people. If you think about, we kind of segregate ourselves, separate ourselves by political affiliation, gender, race, generation, sexual orientation, religion, styles, fashion, class. We live in a culture today we can always talk about our differences. And in today's society, we want to be an individual, so I'm different from you. Which is good and bad. There's good and bad things about that. But for Whitman in this time, he is trying to figure out how to connect with, or how to find similarities between himself and these people that are around him. So if we look at just this first 3 sections here, we can assume that he is seeking connection with other people, seeking connection with strangers, people he doesn't know, and hoping to make a connection through the fact that they're all seeing the same thing. So this is a big theme in Crossing Brooklyn Ferry, and this is a big thing for Whitman because he wants to emphasize the human experience, and he's really excited about that, and he's hoping to push that forward. And so he's really blunt about his curiosity about people, and the fact that all these different people are on this ferry. And so this is kind of addressed to people on the ship. So section 4 really is, if you look at the last half of section 3, he talks really about the natural things you see on a ferry. And then section 4, he talks about these things are the similar. I see these things, you see these things. And then chapter 5, I think, is sort of the thesis statement or the big point when he says, what is it then between us? What is the count of scores, 100 years between us? So he's saying, what is it? Why are we separated? Almost like hoping that he can think about how I'm a human being, you're a human being, we can get along, we're normal, we're just human beings, And so it's sort of a unified hope in this poem. And so that's kind of the nature of Whitman, to experience, to connect with people of all different types. He actually, I wore my flannel today. He was always dressing sort of like working class type guy, always trying to connect with every type of person. Like I said, he's an extrovert. And in the same way, Crossing Brooklyn Ferry has that theme to it of connecting with other people. And I want to end with this, and part 6 is about the fact that all people have weaknesses, flaws. They do things that are wrong. And he tries to connect with people in the sense that they are flawed and they have problems. And he says, I am he who knew what it is to be evil. I I blabbed, blushed, resented, lied, stole, grudged, had guile, anger, lust, hot wishes I dare not speak of, was wayward, vain, greedy, shallow, sly, cowardly, malignant. And so he lists all these things that are wrong and separate people. And so he's kind of confessing these things and saying, hey, I'm flawed. He says, knew what it was to be evil. And so he's admitting these things. And he tries to connect with the reader on this too and says, hey, I know that I'm not perfect. I know that you're not perfect. Maybe we can connect on that too. So it's not like everything's great. He's kind of confessing to us all the things that's wrong with him. So that's another way he's connecting. And this is sort of, I think, a realistic perspective of the human experience. It's also like, I want to connect with people, but also know that I'm not perfect. And so it's kind of disarming, the part 6 of this poem. So that's kind of a overall, overview of Whitman and his goals as he's writing. And so this is a long poem. This is the longest poem I'm going to read. And then when you hit Dickinson is much shorter than this. So he's long-winded, but I think he has a larger point to make. So I just wanted to go over briefly Whitman a little bit. And you can look at my notes online. I've posted my notes, a lot of the things I just said here, if you want to go back over them. And hope you enjoy poetry, and please email me if you have any questions. Hope you guys have a good day.